$105,000. I stared at that number on a spreadsheet at 11 at night, kids asleep down the hall, and felt something close to nausea. Not because the number was new information, exactly. I'd known it was bad. I just hadn't ever let myself actually add it all up in one place, all at once, in black and white, refusing to be rounded down or explained away. So I did something that sounded insane out loud the first time I said it to my wife. I stopped buying anything that wasn't food, gas, or medicine for an entire year. No new clothes, no eating out, no gadgets, no home decor, no impulse anything. Just the absolute essentials for 12 straight months, while every extra dollar went straight at that number until it was gone. This is the story of that year, what it actually felt like, the parts that nearly broke me, and how $105,000 in debt became zero. Nobody wakes up one morning and decides to owe six figures. It happens in pieces, each one small enough to explain away on its own, until you look up one day and the pieces have quietly built a mountain. Ours started with a kitchen, a reasonable renovation, on paper, financed through a home equity loan that felt almost responsible at the time, since it was technically attached to the house and the house was technically going up in value. The contractor found problems behind the walls nobody had budgeted for. The problems behind the walls found more problems. What started as a $30,000 project finished as something considerably larger. Paid for the same way most renovations get paid for. Once the original number stops being real, one more draw against the loan, one more, we're already in this deep conversation in the driveway with the contractor. My wife and I joke now, darkly, that we have the most expensive backsplash in the entire neighborhood, possibly the county. At the time, every single additional draw felt like the only reasonable choice available, because stopping halfway through a torn-up kitchen isn't really an option anybody offers you. You're either finishing the project or living with exposed subfloor, and the loan officer, to his credit, never once made either option feel difficult to choose. Around that same time, I got a genuinely good bonus year at work, and instead of banking it, I traded in a perfectly fine truck for a nicer one. The math felt easy to justify. I'd earned it. The old truck had some miles on it. 6 months later, the bonus was long spent, and the new truck payment was just another fixed cost, sitting next to the mortgage. Indifferent to whether the next year was as good as the last one, which it wasn't. I still remember exactly how good that truck smelled driving it off the lot, and I genuinely cannot remember a single specific thing the bonus itself bought me that lasted longer than a season. One purchase I can still point to in the driveway every day. The other one just evaporated, and I couldn't tell you into what. The credit cards crept in the way credit cards always seem to. One started purely for emergencies, a phrase that quietly stopped meaning anything once a slow month at work turned into using it for groceries, then gas, then the gap between two paychecks that never quite closed again. A second card got opened for a promotional rate that expired long before the balance did. By the time I actually sat down and added every single number together, credit cards alone had crossed $38,000. A figure that genuinely didn't feel real to me, even as I was staring directly at it. Underneath all of that, quietly, sat an old student loan balance I'd been making minimum payments on for years, without ever once attacking the principal. Because there was always something louder, demanding the money first. $15,000 of old decisions, still charging interest, still waiting patiently at the bottom of a pile that kept growing on top of it. That balance had been there so long it had basically become part of the furniture, the way an old stain on a carpet eventually stops registering as something you should probably do something about. I'd paid that loan on autopilot for over a decade, minimum payment, same day, every month. Somehow never once sat down to calculate how much of each payment was actually touching the original amount versus just feeding the interest that kept it alive. None of these decisions, looked at individually, seemed reckless in the moment they were made. The kitchen needed fixing. The truck felt earned. The card felt temporary. That's precisely what made the total so disorienting once I finally forced myself to look at it as one single number instead of 4 separate, forgivable stories. Each individual decision had a reasonable defense attorney standing right next to it, ready to argue the case the second I tried to feel bad about it. It was only when I put all 4 defendants in the same room side by side that the pattern became impossible to keep defending. One mistake is a story. 4 mistakes compounding quietly against each other for years is a mountain with your name on the deed. So what exactly counts as nothing? My wife asked that question about 10 minutes into the conversation. It turned out to be the single most important question of the entire year, because vague rules are exactly how you talk yourself into exceptions by week 3. We sat down and actually wrote it out, like a contract, because a verbal commitment to deprivation apparently doesn't survive contact with a particularly good sale. Food, gas, medicine, and existing bills stayed. Everything else stopped completely. No new clothes, no replacing things that still technically worked, no eating out, no streaming upgrades, no random little purchases that would normally never register as a decision at all. If it wasn't keeping us alive or keeping the lights on, it waited. We also agreed on one specific exception that took some negotiating, gifts for our kids on actual birthdays and the holidays, because punishing 2 children for their parents' spreadsheet seemed like a different kind of mistake entirely. Everything else got the same blunt test, necessary or not necessary. No middle category, no but it's on sale loophole, no technically a need gray area we could quietly expand whenever it suited us. The first 2 weeks felt almost like a game, the kind of energy you get at the start of any challenge before reality actually shows up to test it. I told co-workers about it half-jokingly at lunch, expecting maybe a laugh and a quick change of subject. Instead, I got something closer to fascination, several guys admitting they'd thought about doing something similar and never actually committed, which told me more about how common our exact situation was than I expected going in. One co-worker in particular kept circling back to it over the following weeks, asking quiet little follow-up questions during slow moments at work, the kind of questions that sound casual but are clearly doing some math in the background. I think a part of him was looking for permission, and a part of me, looking back, was looking for the same thing back when I first said it out loud to my wife. The first real test arrived faster than I'd hoped. My running shoes blew out a hole near the big toe, the unmistakable kind that ends a shoe's career under any normal circumstances. Normal circumstances would have meant a quick trip to buy a new pair without a second thought. Instead, I found a shoe repair shop I didn't know existed, an actual cobbler, the kind of place that feels like a time capsule from a decade nobody else remembers fondly. 20 minutes and a small fee later, the shoes were running again, and I genuinely hadn't thought about shoe repair as an option in my entire adult life until that exact moment. The cobbler, an older guy who clearly didn't get many customers under 60, seemed almost delighted to have a job that didn't involve orthopedic dress shoes for once. He asked what brought me in, and when I gave him the honest answer instead of the polite one, he just nodded slowly. Like he'd seen this exact realization arrive on a lot of faces before mine, usually a few decades later than it had arrived on mine. A friend's birthday dinner came up during week 4, the kind of restaurant outing that used to be an automatic yes. I almost backed out entirely rather than explain myself. Instead, I showed up, ordered water, ate beforehand, and told the table honestly what I was doing when someone asked why I wasn't ordering. The reaction wasn't judgment. It was mostly curiosity, and one guy at the table quietly admitted afterward that he probably needed to do something similar himself, just hadn't found the nerve yet. I'd spent the entire drive over rehearsing some smoother, less embarrassing version of the explanation, the kind that makes a man sound disciplined instead of desperate. In the end, I just said it plainly. No spin, no humble brag dressed up as honesty. Turns out, plain and honest landed better than anything I'd rehearsed, the way it usually does, once you actually try it, instead of just assuming it'll go badly. Month 5 nearly broke the whole thing, and it wasn't one dramatic moment. It was 3 smaller ones stacked close enough together that they almost finished what the debt itself hadn't managed to. By that point, the novelty had completely worn off. The first 2 months had a strange kind of energy to them, almost like a sport, something to talk about and feel slightly proud of out loud. By month 5, the conversation about it had gone quiet, the way any commitment eventually does, once the people around you stop asking how it's going. Quiet is exactly when commitments tend to fail, because nobody's watching closely enough anymore for the slip to feel like it actually counts. The first was a golf trip. 4 buddies, a long-planned weekend at a course 2 of them had been talking about for over a year, the kind of trip you say yes to instantly under normal circumstances. I said no, and the silence on the group chat after I explained why lasted long enough that I genuinely wondered if I just torched a friendship over a spreadsheet. They went without me. I spent that entire Saturday doing yard work I'd been putting off, checking my phone more than I'd like to admit, watching photos roll in from a course I'd been wanting to play for years. One of those buddies called me that Sunday night, unprompted, just to say he respected what I was doing more than he'd let on in the group chat. He'd been carrying his own quiet version of the same problem for years, he admitted, just hadn't said the number out loud to anyone yet. That phone call did more for my resolve than the entire weekend of golf would have, which is not a sentence I ever expected to be saying about a missed golf trip. The second moment happened in a hardware store, standing directly in front of a table saw I'd wanted for longer than the debt itself had existed, marked down further than I'd ever seen it. I picked it up off the shelf. I genuinely stood there for what felt like 10 minutes, doing increasingly creative mental math about how this particular purchase was actually an investment in future projects that would save money down the line. I put it back. Walking out of that store empty-handed remains one of the more difficult 5 minutes of the entire year, which says something slightly absurd about a grown man and a power tool. I drove home a slightly longer route than necessary that day, past the hardware store's lot a second time, just to confirm to myself the saw hadn't somehow followed me out the door. It hadn't. I genuinely laughed out loud in the car at how ridiculous that impulse was, and also recognized uncomfortably exactly how serious the temptation had actually been 5 minutes earlier. The third one hurt the most. My son made a travel baseball team that spring, the kind of opportunity a parent genuinely wants to say yes to without a second of hesitation. The registration fee alone landed at a number that would have required pulling from the debt payment directly. I told him we needed a few days to think about it. The first time in his entire life I hadn't said yes to something like that on the spot. The look on his face wasn't anger, it was confusion. Like he was trying to figure out which version of his dad he was currently talking to. I went and sat in the garage by myself for a few minutes after that conversation, which is something I genuinely never do, just to let the discomfort actually finish landing instead of swallowing it immediately and moving on to the next task. The version of me that built this debt would have said yes instantly and figured out the math later, the same way I'd figured out the math later on a kitchen, a truck, and 2 credit cards. The version of me sitting in that garage was trying very hard not to be that guy anymore. And it turns out, trying very hard feels almost exactly like guilt from the inside. We found a way to make it work eventually, picking up an extra weekend shift that month instead of touching the debt money. But those few days of we need to think about it sat with me longer than almost anything else from that entire year. That was the moment the math stopped being abstract and started actually costing me something I genuinely valued. I expected the hardest part of that year to be the missing. Missing restaurants, missing new clothes, missing the easy yes to whatever caught my eye that week. What actually happened surprised me enough that I started writing it down. almost like field notes from inside my own head. Somewhere around month 6, the constant low hum of wanting things just started to quiet down, not because I developed some monk-like discipline. More because want, it turns out, partly runs on possibility. Once a purchase genuinely wasn't on the table, my brain seemed to stop bothering to generate the want in the first place. The same way you stop smelling a candle after it's been burning in the same room for an hour. The desire had always required a door left slightly open. We'd shut the door completely, and the wanting eventually stopped knocking. I tested this theory accidentally one Saturday, walking through a mall with my wife for an unrelated reason, something with the kids' school. Stores I would have previously browsed out of pure habit just registered as scenery, the same way a furniture showroom registers to someone who already has a house full of furniture. Nothing in there was mine to consider anymore, and not considering it turned out to be a genuinely restful way to walk through a building I used to leave feeling slightly worse than when I'd entered. The second surprise was how much mental energy came back to me once I wasn't making 15 small purchasing decisions a day. I hadn't realized how much background processing power those decisions were quietly using until they disappeared entirely. Should I get this? Should I upgrade that? Is this worth it? An entire category of low-grade mental noise just went silent. The quiet that replaced it felt almost suspicious at first, like waiting for the other shoe to drop on a problem that had actually just resolved itself. My wife noticed it before I did, actually, and mentioned it almost as an aside one evening. I seemed less scattered, she said, less likely to drift mid-conversation the way I used to when something on a screen or a shelf had quietly hijacked a corner of my attention. I hadn't connected the two things myself until she said it out loud, but she was right. A mind not constantly evaluating purchases turns out to have a surprising amount of room left over for the people actually in front of it. I also started noticing things I already owned, the way you'd notice something brand new. A jacket I'd had for 3 years suddenly got worn constantly, mostly because it was simply there and perfectly fine. The part of my brain that used to scan for an upgrade had nothing left to scan for. My garage, my closet, my own kitchen, all of it slowly stopped looking like a collection of slightly outdated stuff and started looking like a collection of things that, examined honestly, already did exactly what I needed. The biggest surprise by far was realizing how much of my old spending had quietly been standing in for something else entirely. Attention I wasn't giving my family. Boredom I didn't know how to sit with. A sense of accomplishment I'd been chasing in a shopping cart instead of anywhere closer to home. Once the spending stopped, those underlying things didn't disappear. They just got a lot harder to ignore, which, looking back, was probably the actual point of the entire year, whether I'd planned it that way or not. I don't think I fully understood that connection until I caught myself on a particularly boring Tuesday evening with nothing to buy and nowhere to direct that restlessness. Actually sitting down and playing a board game with my kids instead. It wasn't a grand realization in the moment. It was just the only thing left to do with an evening that used to quietly dissolve into a screen and a cart. The board game wasn't a sacrifice. It was just what filled the space the spending used to occupy, and it turned out to be considerably better company. We attacked it in a specific order, and the order mattered more than I expected going in. Highest interest first, every single time, regardless of which balance felt the most satisfying to watch disappear. The 2 credit cards went first because nothing else on that list was charging us anywhere close to what those cards were quietly charging every single month just for existing. Every part of me wanted to attack the smallest balance first instead, purely for the quick win, the early dopamine hit of crossing something off entirely. We forced ourselves to do the math instead of following the feeling, and the math was unambiguous. Paying off the highest interest debt first saved us real money over the course of the year, money that, ironically, made every later payoff happen that much faster. The not buying alone freed up a genuinely surprising amount of money once we actually tracked it against our old spending, more than either of us expected sitting at that kitchen table back in month 1. But it wasn't enough on its own to move 6 figures in a year, and we both knew that going in, so we got aggressive in other directions too. I picked up extra shifts whenever they came available. My wife took on some freelance work in the evenings after the kids went to bed. We sold things that had been sitting around doing nothing. An old motorcycle in the garage I hadn't ridden in years, a kayak we used maybe twice a summer, golf clubs from a membership I'd already quietly let lapse. The tax refund that spring went straight at the balance the same afternoon it landed. No negotiation, no small treat, first as a reward for waiting. Watching that single deposit erase an entire credit card balance in one transaction remains one of the most satisfying few seconds of my entire financial life. Genuinely more satisfying than any purchase that balance had originally been built from. By month 9, both credit cards were gone completely. The old student loan balance went next, the one that had been quietly sitting there collecting interest for over a decade without me ever once attacking the principal directly. Watching that balance finally move, after years of watching it barely budge under minimum payments, felt like finally winning an argument I'd been quietly losing since college. I actually called the loan servicer that day, mostly out of disbelief, just to confirm the balance really was gone and not some display error on my end. The representative on the phone sounded almost as surprised as I was. Mentioned she didn't see balances clear that fast very often. I remember thinking that was a strange thing to feel proud of, outpacing the typical timeline for paying off a student loan I'd been quietly avoiding really looking at for over 10 years. The truck loan and the home equity balance from the kitchen were the last 2 standing, and we threw everything we had left at both of them simultaneously through the final stretch. The morning the very last payment cleared, I checked the account 3 separate times before I actually believed the number sitting there. 0, not low, not almost there. 0 on every single account that had carried a balance the year before. I woke up before everyone else that morning specifically to check, which I'd been doing for weeks as the balance got smaller. Half expecting the number to be wrong, half scared the universe would find some way to add a fee back onto it just to spite me. It didn't. The number stayed at 0 through a second cup of coffee, then a third, until I finally let myself actually believe it instead of just staring at it suspiciously. I didn't celebrate the way I expected to. No big purchase, obviously. That would have been a strange way to mark the occasion. I just sat in the kitchen for a while, in the same spot where this entire thing started 11 months and 3 weeks earlier. I felt something closer to quiet than triumphant, the kind of quiet you only get after carrying something heavy for a very long time and finally actually setting it down. The kind of quiet you only get after carrying something heavy for a very long time and finally actually setting it down. Hold on to that feeling for a second because there's more to say about it than the debt itself. If you made it through this whole story with me, genuinely thank you. This wasn't a quick list of tips. It was a year of my actual life, the embarrassing parts included, and I appreciate you sitting with all of it instead of skipping to some 5-second summary. Subscribe to this channel if any part of it landed because there's a lot more honest, specific storytelling like this coming, built from things that actually happened instead of generic advice that could have happened to anyone. I almost made this video as a tidy list instead. 10 lessons from my debt-free year. The same format you've probably seen 100 times on this kind of channel. It felt dishonest somehow, compressing an actual year of actual struggle into bullet points. Some things only make sense as the whole story, golf trip included, table saw included, garage included. While you're here, tell me in the comments what your version of that number is, or was, or still is. You don't need to type the exact figure if that feels like too much. Just tell me whether you've ever done your own version of adding it all up in one place, refusing to round it down. That moment, more than anything else, is usually where actual change starts for most men I've talked to about this. I'm not asking out of curiosity for its own sake. Every single comment I read under videos like this one shapes what I cover next. And the honest ones, the specific ones, are worth more to me than 100 polite, great video comments combined. Here's what I keep coming back to, looking at this whole year from a distance now. The headline of this video is $105,000 in debt becoming zero. And that's true, and it matters, and I'm genuinely proud of it. But the actual prize of that year wasn't the number hitting zero. It was everything that number forced me to notice along the way, things about my own habits, my own avoidance, my own quiet substitutions of spending for feelings I didn't know how to handle any other way. If you'd told me on day one that the most valuable part of the year would be a board game on a Tuesday and a phone call from a buddy about a missed golf trip, I'd have assumed you were trying to make a depressing year sound better than it actually was. Looking back honestly, those small moments outlasted the satisfaction of the zero balance by a wide margin. The debt going to zero felt incredible for about a week. The way I see my own time and attention now has stuck around considerably longer than that. A year of buying nothing sounds on paper like a story about restriction. Living through it, it was actually a story about attention, where mine had been going for years without my permission, where it finally got to go once I stopped feeding it constant small decisions to make instead. The debt got paid off because the spending stopped. The spending stopped, really, because I finally let myself notice what it had been covering up the entire time. I'm not going to pretend every man watching this has a six-figure number behind his own version of this story. Some of you have 10,000. Some of you have considerably more than I did. The size of the number was never really the point of telling you this. The point was that the number, whatever yours happens to be, only moves once you've actually looked directly at it. The way I finally looked at mine that night at 11 o'clock with the kids asleep down the hall. Remember that spreadsheet at 11 at night, the number sitting there, refusing to be rounded down. I think about that moment more than I think about the actual day the last payment cleared, honestly, because that was the moment everything else became possible. The zero balance was the result. The willingness to actually look was the part that mattered. I keep that spreadsheet still, oddly enough the original one, untouched, with that exact number sitting at the top of it. Not as a trophy, more as a reminder of how close I came to never opening it honestly at all. How many quiet years I'd spent rounding that exact number down in my head before I finally let myself see the real one. People ask me sometimes if we're still living like it's month one of that year, no spending at all, white-knuckling every purchase decision forever. We're not, and I don't think we should be. The point was never to live permanently like that. The point was figuring out which parts of how we used to spend were actually serving us, and which parts were just noise we'd never bothered to question. The first thing we bought after the year officially ended was a decent dinner out. Just the two of us, no kids, no occasion beyond marking the actual end of something genuinely hard. It tasted different than dinners out used to taste somehow. Like the meal itself had more weight to it because it had been chosen deliberately instead of happening on autopilot the way most of our old spending used to happen. Some of the old patterns have tried to creep back in, if I'm being completely honest with you. A subscription here, a slightly nicer version of something we didn't strictly need there. The difference now is how fast I catch it. What used to take years to even notice now takes about a week, sometimes less, because I finally know what I'm actually looking for when old habits start quietly reasserting themselves. I caught myself last month justifying a purchase using almost the exact same language I used to justify the kitchen renovation with: technically true, fairly reasonable, surely fine. I noticed the pattern this time before the purchase happened, instead of years afterward, while staring at a spreadsheet. That gap between noticing in the moment versus noticing years later is genuinely the entire difference between the man who built that debt and the man writing this script. If there's one thing I'd want a man watching this to walk away with, It's not the specific number, and it's not even the specific rules we used that year. It's the willingness to do what I did at that kitchen table. Sit down, add the whole thing up honestly in one place, refusing to round anything down or explain anything away. Most men I know are smart enough to fix their own version of this number. The actual obstacle was never the math. It was always whether they were willing to look directly at it first. I genuinely believe that, having sat on both sides of it now. The math, once you actually look, is rarely as complicated as it felt while you were avoiding it. The avoiding is the hard part. The math is just arithmetic, the kind most of us learned in school decades ago, and somehow forgot how to apply to our own bank accounts. If this story found you somewhere honest tonight, do a few things before you go. Follow this channel, because there's more of this kind of specific, lived-in storytelling coming, not generic advice dressed up as inspiration. Send this to 5 people who might need to hear it. The buddy carrying a number he hasn't said out loud yet. The friend who keeps joking about his balance instead of facing it. The guy who'd benefit from knowing somebody else actually did this and survived it. Leave a comment telling me where you are with your own number and tell me what you want covered next, because that's genuinely how this channel keeps getting built, one honest story at a time. I'll see you in the next one.